Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. It's so good to see all of you here for the inaugural session of our conference, Asia on the Move, Histories of Mobility and the Making of Asia. I request our director, Shri Shrivastava, to welcome the gathering.
President of India International Center, Honorable Ambassador Shyam Saran, Professor Sanjay Subrahmanyam, Distinguished Professor of History and Irving and Jean Stone Chair in Social Sciences at the University of California, Los Angeles, Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan, our Executive Director, in charge of our International Research Division, Honorable Delegates, Professor Gitanjali, who is the coordinator of this conference, Honorable Heads of Missions and Ambassadors and members of the organizing committee. The International Conference Asia on the Move, Histories and Mobility of Making Asia carries forward the decades of exploration by IIC-International Research Division on histories of interaction between Asia's different regions and how it is reflected in our monuments, our artifacts, our literature, and our textiles. We have with us delegates, scholars from Hungary, Russia, USA, Uzbekistan, and India. They represent expertise in archaeology and history, literature, music, maritime history, trans-Himalayan trade. They will be discussing their landmark research on records left by Asians who traveled to different parts of this great continent. Yesterday we had a curtain-raising event, which is an exhibition on traveling relics spreading the word of Buddha. The exhibition tells the stories about early archaeological discoveries and recovery of Buddhist history. I request all those of you who have not seen the exhibition to kindly do so. This conference has been conceptualized by our President, Ambassador Shyam Saran. He was duly assisted by the members of the organizing committee who worked on the themes of the session of this conference. I thank Ambassador Shyam Saran for his guidance and indulgence in making this conference a reality. Responding to our invitation, Professor Sanjay Subrahmanyam, a very distinguished and internationally well-known professor of history, has come all the way from US to participate in this conference and to deliver the keynote address. On behalf of IIC, the organizing committee, and everyone who is associated with the IIC, I profusely thank Professor Sanjay Subrahmanyam for his kind gesture. I thank Professor Himanshu Prabhare and Professor Gitanjali Surendran, who have jointly curated the exhibition on Buddha. And as I mentioned earlier, Professor Gitanjali is also the coordinator of this conference. I thank both of them. I also thank the Indian and foreign scholars, delegates who have responded to our invitation and have come to participate in this important conference. I thank the ambassadors and heads of missions who have shown very keen interest in this conference and are present here. I will be failing in my duty if I do not thank the members of our organizing committee who, after holding several meetings, finalized the nitty-gritty of this conference. I thank my colleagues, Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan, Executive Director, IIC-IRD, and her team who have worked relentlessly for this conference. Finally, I thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for your gracious presence, and I look forward to active participation in all the sessions of this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. I invite Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan, Executive Director of the International Research Division, to speak to us.
So greetings to everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I see a full hall, and that's also an indication of the interest that many people have in this conference. I just want to set the context for this conference in the light of the International Research Division, which has started this project called IIC Asia project, it used to be called, now it is the International Research Division. And we have been focusing in the last few years on conferences and interactions between the Asian countries, between Asia and other regions. So this particular conference looks at the same theme in a broad way. So I'd like to put it in context of what we have been doing so far. So the International Research Division had its inception as the IIC Asia project with Dr. Karan Singh, which started by him in 1997, with a view to giving Asian countries a platform to interact, explore connections and divergences through how these cultural and intellectual undercurrents feed into the conversations of today. There have been several conferences held annually exploring the circulation of material culture, the translation of texts, the movement of people, goods and services, and with them of political and administrative systems. This led to fruitful insights into broader themes such as the sideways and byways of interaction between interstate relations and the relations between nomadic and settled people. From 2003, the Asia project, now called the International Research Division, was led by Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan, who continued the dialogue, helped create a framework for interpreting aspects of our heritage, shared, resulting in significant publications such as Cultures of Indigo Across Asia, Sacred Landscapes, and how these are shaped, for example, by monuments, motifs, and narratives, on crossing boundaries with needle and thread, called Sui Dhaga, basically on the embroidery traditions of shared Asia, then on maritime cultural heritage, and on Asian encounters, networks of cultural interaction, to name a few. Since 2022, we have started a collaborative research and documentation project by the IIC-International Research Division called Samhita, with the support of the Ministry of External Affairs, the Government of India. Samhita is largely a South Asian manuscript histories and textual archive, and its goal is to create a kind of a database, an open access digital library on manuscripts of South Asian and Indian provenance housed in libraries outside India, which will serve as a collective resource for Asia's knowledge systems. So this conference, in the light of all this, takes a relook at connected histories with travel as the motive, from ancient to modern times, traveling for trade, education, spiritual reasons, adventure, leisure, and several other reasons, and which has fostered interaction between Asian regions through connections and divergences. In the next 2 days, we will look closely at these key aspects of interaction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for setting the context, ma'am. I'll request our chair of the session, the President of IIC, Ambassador Shyam Saran, to say a few words.
Thank you. Let me first of all welcome Dr. Subrahmanyam. We are extremely grateful to him to have accepted our invitation. And it is a tribute to his expertise that we have made him the keynote speaker for this conference, and to literally set the stage for what will follow. So thank you very much for being with us. Why are we having this conference? There is always an issue, is Asia a really identifiable entity? Is it a space that has a certain personality, has a certain kind of, a commonality that brings it together? Many people say it is a Western conception, Asia. So is there something which we can call an Asian personality? This is certainly a space through which invaders, traders, pilgrims, adventurers have gone back and forth over the centuries. And, it is through their perceptions, their, eyewitness accounts that we get some sense of the affinities which actually have grown over a period of time, layer upon layer over the centuries. So perhaps there is something like an Asia, but that is really the theme that we wanted to explore in this conference. But the unique feature is that instead of having very scholarly kind of research papers, what we are really looking at, how did Asia appear to these various travelers and, pilgrims or adventurers who went through Asia. So that is the unique feature of this conference. So Professor Subrahmanyam will be speaking to us about the role of port cities. He's an expert on the Indian Ocean space. So it is with very keen interest that we will be listening to his presentation. Professor Subrahmanyam, welcome to you again, and you have the floor now. Yeah. You don't have the monitor here.
It's a privilege to have with us Professor Sanjay Subrahmanyam, who's an authority on Indian Ocean studies and his mastery of archives from across languages. He's worked for years on experiments in connected histories and travel writing in Persia. And his forthcoming book, Across the Green Sea, will look at the history of the Indian Ocean from the viewpoints of Western India and the Persian Gulf and East Africa. We're very privileged.
Thank you. So perhaps the statutory warning to turn your telephones on to silent may be necessary before we begin. I have just turned mine on to silent. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I have a long association with this center, going back actually to a time when some of you may remember when Ambassador Madhavan was the director of the center, and actually he had invited me at that time, which go back probably 30 years or more, to participate in a set of meetings and discussions on Indian Ocean history and Indian Ocean studies. And I remember that subsequently in the late 1980s, we also had a very moving memorial meeting for the late Professor Ashwin Das Gupta after he passed. So I have a long association. In fact, if I wanted to dig deep enough, which actually goes back to my father, who was a member from the 1960s of this center. So it's a pleasure to be here, and it's something which I don't do often enough. So perhaps this could be the start of something good, as the song goes. Now, my purpose today is to address you on the question of port cities and mobility in early modern Asia, which is, of course, only one aspect of mobility in Asia. I'm picking the maritime direction. There is obviously much to be said also on overland connections, which is also something which I've been interested in, and I and many others have worked, for example, on the great significance, for instance, of the routes that passed through Central Asia and their significance, another kind of sea, which you might call it from a certain point of view. My purpose here as I begin is to, of course, remind you that we are hardly the first to reflect on this as a problem or as a concept. Here, for example, is the writing of an Ottoman admiral, Sayyid Ali Rais, who was sent by the Ottomans in the 1550s to intervene in order to help the sultans of Gujarat in the difficulties they were having with the Portuguese. And he wound up actually losing control of his fleet in a storm. He suffered a shipwreck. Part of his ships and some of his cannon washed up off the coast of Gujarat. He eventually made his way to Ahmedabad, where he spent some time, and he actually wrote one of his interesting texts there. And then finally made his way back through Sindh into Iran, and then via the fringes of the Caspian Sea, somehow managing to negotiate with difficulties the differences between the Sunni Ottomans and the Shia Safavis. He managed to come back to the Ottoman Empire, where he wrote several texts, including one which is still worth a read, of which there's no good modern translation in English, unfortunately, called Miratul Mamalik, Mirror of Kingdoms, where he talks about India at that time, and India where actually he had a very interesting, shall we say, sort of privileged seat at the moment when Humayun died, because he was actually present at the Mughal court when this incident took place, still a controversial incident, the circumstances in which he died are not entirely clear. And he actually tells us that he was the one, we can take this with a pinch of salt, he was the one who told the Mughals not to announce that Humayun had died because his son was away, and that actually what they should do is find a courtier who more or less resembled him, bandage him, and say that the emperor had a fall and he was hurt, and so then they would present him to the public from a distance until the time, of course, when Akbar, who was away, perhaps in the Punjab, came back, and then the succession could be carried through. So this is someone who actually had, as I said, a sort of a very privileged view of a lot of different things which happened, and who also reflected actually on something which is, I think, of great importance for us, which is the question of how different the Indian Ocean is as a sea. Sayyid Ali, let me remind you, was basically a Mediterranean sailor. He was someone who had actually been trained in the Mediterranean with the great North African seaman and admiral Khairuddin Barbarossa. And what he tells us is that you may know how to navigate the Mediterranean, but that is no guarantee that you know how to navigate the Indian Ocean. And so, in fact, one of the things that he did when he was in the Indian Ocean, and he must have been a man of some cunning and resources, is that he actually managed to collect a whole series of texts, typically in Arabic, of people such as the famous navigator Ahmad ibn Majid al-Najdi or Suleiman al-Mahrusi, and so on. And so he actually collected these and digested them. And he gives us a sense that the Indian Ocean is not in a way one ocean. And if we actually consider the fact that there is also something else called maritime Asia going beyond the fringes of the Indian Ocean, it gets even more complicated when we enter into East Asia, the South China Sea, the Sea of Japan. This is still another world. And then, of course, we have the central part of the Indian Ocean, which is the middle circle, which you see over there, and then the Western Indian Ocean, each of these having their own integrity in certain senses. Now, of course, again, coming to the question of port cities, I'm hardly the first to have reflected on this. I just want to mention to you two different books which came out over the years. One by, on the left, by a colleague in Australia who I had the privilege of working with, Frank Browser, Brides of the Sea. He also published a second volume essentially on port cities. That term, that the port is the bride of the sea, is actually something which comes from an Arabic text on Jeddah from the 16th century. On the right over here, you have the very distinguished Japanese historian Haneda Masashi, who with his colleagues put together this other volume, Asian Port Cities, which deal with a number of different things, including some questions to which I will return today. So what am I going to talk about today? I want to actually touch on a number of different key concepts and ideas that I'm going to come back to again and again while I'm going through this exercise. So first of all, I want to devote a certain amount of attention to what we call urban morphology. Right? So what do cities actually look like as structures? Is there such a thing as a port city, a typical port city? Or in fact, are there very many different types of port cities in the context even of the Indian Ocean? And implicitly, of course, there is another question: how different is the port city, let us say, from the interior city? Right? So how different is, in the case of Iran, Bandar Abbas from Isfahan? How different is Surat from Delhi, and so on? So that is one set of questions, which are essentially questions about examining space, the organization of space, and so on. And as I said, coming then to a second question, which is the types of port cities, because one of my arguments will be that, first of all, historically, there have always been many different types of port cities, and this is especially the case when we enter the period that I'm dealing with, when a certain number of interventions by external participants who came in, notably the Europeans, transformed certain things in terms of the rules of the game concerning how port cities were organized. How they were organized depends on several different things. It depends on also questions of the ethnic composition of these cities. What are the forms of the kinds of ethnicities which one finds there? Because that is, of course, something which you can take for granted which is there is almost no such thing as a port city which is inhabited by a single ethnicity. They are always multi-ethnic sites, and that ethnicity is in turn a function of the second problem, the problem of mobility, which is in a way at the center of this conference, which is to say people move, and people in the course of moving also settle for a time, sometimes for much longer, in specific places, creating this multi-ethnic landscape. Now, when we talk about ethnicity, however, I want to also mention something which I think is quite significant and important, which is I want to remind you that we need to get away from a certain kind of, shall we say, a devotion to the religion of ethnicity. Which is something which, of course, many people have increasingly become fond of. Ethnic nationalisms, ethnic assertions are very common in our day. And I want to remind you of a concept which has been used by a number of different people, but especially I'm thinking of my friends and colleagues who have worked, for example, on the native peoples of the Americas, which is the idea of ethnogenesis, which is the idea that these ethnicities are not fixed, are not stable, they're actually moving in of themselves and moving over time. Their boundaries are shifting, and again, this takes us back to the previous point. Ethnogenesis and mobility are very clearly linked as processes. And finally, there's something which I want to mention to you, at least, which is, of course, a problem which has been dealt with by a number of different people, myself included, which is the question of cosmopolitanism in port cities. Is this an appropriate term to be used for the Indian Ocean port city, or what are its limits, what are its problems? I want to flag this for you. Okay, so I want to begin then with with Southeast Asia. Right, rather than India. I will eventually come to South Asia. So I want to begin with Southeast Asia because if you look at the literature on the Indian Ocean, when one thinks of people focusing on a single port city site, there's a typical place where most people like to begin when they're discussing the Indian Ocean of the later medieval and the early modern period. And that is actually a site which is interestingly located in Southeast Asia, but its history is not a history which is solely a Southeast Asian history. Why? Because many of you will know that in the early 15th century, there was a series of celebrated expeditions sent by the Ming Dynasty into Southeast Asia and subsequently into the Western Indian Ocean, all the way to the Swahili coast, and also touching on the Persian Gulf and touching on the Red Sea. There were several accounts that came out of this. The most famous of these is the one which you see on the left, the account of Ma Huan, and you also have subsequent accounts, retrospective accounts, such as the one that you see here on the right. These accounts are very interesting. They are Chinese accounts, but a couple of peculiarities need to be borne in mind. The admiral who led these expeditions, the famous Zheng He, was not from a maritime region, right? He was from Yunnan. So he was actually from the southwestern part of China, bordering on Burma. The second thing which needs to be borne in mind was he himself was Muslim, and so was the writer of the text on the left, Ma Huan. He was also a Muslim, which actually gave him certain privileges. For example, he was able to give us some greater details, for instance, about the state of the Hejaz in the 15th century than a non-Muslim writer would have been able to give us. But for instance, he has a very idealized view of some Muslim states. For instance, he covers the rulers of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, to which I'll return with praise. Now, one of the consequences of this Chinese intervention in Southeast Asia was that this intervention actually helped to solidify the position of a particular port city, and that was this city of Malacca. Right? Now, Malacca is located, as many of you will know, on the Straits of Malacca, so somewhat further up from the location of Singapore today. It replaced, or shall we say, came to dominate in a situation which had earlier been dominated by ports on the other side of the Straits of Malacca. But Malacca's emergence was very clearly linked in some way, but we can't exactly say how, with these Chinese expeditions. So the Chinese intervened, the Chinese redistributed the cards of the game, and as a consequence, this new city arose. Initially, the rulers of this city were what we would, shall we say, very loosely call Hindu. And it's really in the second generation that they converted to Islam. That was a particular ruler called Parameshvara, converted to Islam and established tributary rights with the Ming dynasty, to which they continued through much of the 15th century to send materials, exotic objects, and so on. Now, we do know something about Malacca. We have particularly a good deal of material coming to us, unfortunately a bit late. So for the 16th century, our problem is for most of the 15th century, the history of Malacca is somewhat obscured by the absence of actually a thickness of archival documents. But we do have some Malay texts which are somewhat difficult to deal with. But at any rate, what we can see is the emergence of a certain morphology of Malacca, which you see over here. So what do we see in Malacca? We see something which is very clear, which is we see a city where the ethnicities are separated, right? So the chief ethnicities, each of them inhabit a separate quarter. So which are the chief ethnicities in Malacca? Unsurprisingly, the Chinese. So you have Bukit China. But also there is a very substantial number of Indians present, Indians from 3 regions of India. So Indians from what is called Benoit Kling, which is to say the whole of what we would today call the Coromandel coast and going beyond. Etymologically, of course, you would realize Kling is Kalinga, but it is nevertheless used for everybody coming all the way from Tamil Nadu, Andhra, and going up into Orissa. So this is one set of people. Perhaps the most important group of Indians in Malacca in the 15th century are the Gujaratis, who again tend to be of different subgroups. They too inhabit a specific set of quarters. And then, of course, you have some other groups, all the way to groups from what would be today the region of Okinawa and the so-called Ryukyu Islands and so on and so forth. So you actually have people distributed from across this whole maritime space, but when they are in Malacca, each of them tends to be located in a separate space and tends to have a separate leader who then is in interface with the Sultan and the Sultan's establishment, and this leader typically takes the title here of the Shah Bandar, which is not the same meaning as the title will have in some other places. But here, the Shah Bandar is per community. Each community has its own Shah Bandar. Now, as I said, our difficulty is that we don't know too much about the details of much of this until the Portuguese get there. The Portuguese give us some pretty good accounts of all of this, but they're already retrospective. Why? Because when the Portuguese conquer the city in 1511, they make it clear to the Muslim residents that they're no longer welcome. So there is a kind of mass flight of the Muslims from Malacca. And as a consequence of this, of course, a lot of the Gujaratis are gone by about 1520. A lot of the other Muslim merchants from elsewhere, including Bengal, which is the third area in India from which you have a presence in the city, are also gone. Okay? And what are left, actually, and they're going to eke out a painful existence through the 16th century, are the Tamils, the Kalings. And we actually have some interesting documents, for instance, this very intriguing document, which is a petition signed by the Tamil merchants of Malacca, and you can see it's written in Portuguese, but then at the end you have a set of signatures in Tamil, in which you can identify about 8 or 9 different names of Tamil merchants, including 2 or 3 who were the greatest merchants of the time. Perhaps the greatest surviving merchant by this time was somebody called Suryadeva Nayanar. And Suryadeva was actually the great merchant for trade to the Moluccas and for the high-value spices, which is to say cloves, nutmeg, mace, coming from eastern Indonesia. There had been another great merchant called Setu Nayanar, who had committed suicide not long after the Portuguese took over because he attempted to become a go-between for them. He was disappointed, and apparently he decided to take his own life. So we have, therefore, these indications. We have a specific type of port city here with a specific morphology that you can see. But my argument will be that it is not a typical morphology. It's not the morphology which you're going to see reproduced necessarily time after time in other port cities. So let me warn against the idea that Malacca is, in some senses, the archetype of the port city. It is not. It is a specific port city which has some resemblance to other port cities in the region. So, for example, the medieval port city of Samudra Pasai, which is in Sumatra, on the other side of the strait, Here we have got a set of basically inscriptions from the medieval period. We have one travel account, which is Ibn Battuta, who was there. But we don't have a richness and a density of materials. And so what you actually get is a certain, shall we say, Western Southeast Asian type of port city with a specific type of morphology. So, as I said, it's important not to imagine that one can immediately generalize this into other parts of the Indian Ocean. So let me very quickly come to a second example, which I'll pass on very briefly, but I want to just give you a sense of this very different port city. Right? So this is the port city of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. It is in an island which is located off the coast. It's a very interesting and strange island in many respects, which in fact did not have enough fresh water to keep its population going, and so it was even obliged to bring fresh water from the mainland. It was located next to a much larger island called Keshm, which is much more defensible, which has substantial agriculture. But Hormuz has a particularity, which is that it controls the Straits of Hormuz in a very strategic sort of manner. And in the 14th century, the ubiquitous Ibn Battuta was, of course, here too. And in the 14th century, it emerges and it becomes a place of great significance. You have a set of rulers who are ruling from a palace which is at that northern tip facing the Iranian mainland. And we actually have a whole set of very interesting sites which have been excavated over the years by Iranian and other archaeologists. We have tomb sites, we have gardens, we even know now where the polo ground was of the Shahs. And it's also interesting to see, for example, certain kinds of mythical sites which exist. For example, the mythical green prophet, Haja Khizr, was extremely important in Hormuz, and so there are actually sites which are associated with him in this place. So Hormuz, in a way, dominates the entrance into the Persian Gulf at that tip that you see there. So almost every ship that entered the Persian Gulf with the intention of going further up onto the Iranian coast or as far as Basra and the Shatt al-Arab was obliged to pass through Hormuz, and the Hormuz rulers actually decided not to be a nuisance, and instead actually decided to keep a very low tariff regime. And so their idea was low tariff, high turnover, you get your revenue anyway, right? Rather than having a high tariff, choke everything and try and squeeze the merchants for as much as you can. And several people who passed through Hormuz, including the Chinese Ma Huan in the 15th century, actually give us excellent descriptions. Perhaps the most interesting comes from a Timurid envoy called Abdur Razak Samarkandi, who in the 1440s was sent by Shah Rukh, Timur's son, as an envoy to Calicut, and eventually wound up spending some time in Vijayanagar as well. But he passed some appreciable amounts of time in Hormuz. He, of course, like most people, described it as extremely picturesque. It has this very unusual set of multicolored soils, but he also described it as an extremely difficult, inhospitable climate, and talked about the difficulties of being there. We have, in the case of Hormuz, in comparison to the case of Malacca, we have a much greater density of sources, and that allows us to actually get a much better understanding both of the politics of the city and how it functioned and so on, its morphology and so on and so forth. We in particular have this text, which is yet to be edited by the Abdul Karim Nimdihi, who was an Iranian intellectual who circulated between southern Iran, Hormuz, and eventually spent a later part of his life in Gujarat. And Nimdihi has written several texts. He has written a chronicle, and he was also for a time the secretary of someone who many of you will have heard of, Khaja Mahmud Gavan, who was the Wazir of the Bahmani dynasty. He was his secretary, and so he actually wrote a number of his letters for him. So you can also find Nimdihi's hand in the Insha collections of Mahmud Gavan. So we actually have this set of materials. In the early 16th century, again, inevitably the Portuguese arrived there. The Portuguese are always looking for these strategic points that they can gain control of. And interestingly, because of that, we actually have a set of materials in Arabic and in Persian in the Portuguese archives which have been kept for us. Right? And these actually deal with the first interactions between the Portuguese and the rulers of this island. And what they tell us is that there was a dynasty of rulers going back to the 14th century, but there was also a set of wazirs who were extremely important, very powerful figures, probably more powerful than the sultans. And actually, in the early 16th century, when the Portuguese arrived, the Wazir of Hormuz is somebody who is called Haja Ata Sultani, Haja Ata. And this Haja Ata, several of his letters have been preserved. So here, for example, is one of his letters to Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese governor, where he actually is telling him that he's admonishing Afonso de Albuquerque and telling him that he should behave properly, he should take the proper path, and that he is in touch with the viceroy who is his superior, and that he is in a position therefore to outmaneuver him, which he actually managed to do. Albuquerque tried to take Hormuz once in 1506-7. He was repulsed. And it was only after Haja Ata's death that he was eventually able to take Hormuz in 1515. But the Portuguese decided to do something there, which is to leave the Sultan in place and become a kind of a shadow power behind the Sultan. Now, we know something about the organization of Hormuz. In fact, we know a great deal about it. And we know that its morphology is quite different from the morphology of Malacca. There is no organization here by separate zones for different communities. Perhaps one curious aspect is slightly outside the town, we are told that there were a set of caves and there were Hindu yogis who used to live there. So it's rather interesting that Hindu yogis, presumably from Gujarat or Sindh, had actually made their way to this island. But we can see that this is a much more mixed space in terms of its manner of living and so on. Now, once the Europeans and the Portuguese enter in the 16th century and begin to deal with these different cities, they deal with them in different ways. So in some places, they leave the morphology, shall we say, broadly intact. In the case of Hormuz, interestingly, by contrast with Malacca, in Malacca you remember that they more or less told all the Muslim merchants to leave, right? And which had happened probably within 10 years of their conquest. In Hormuz, this was out of the question. If you asked all the Muslim merchants of Hormuz to leave, there was nothing there, right? So, in fact, they showed, from a pragmatic point of view, a much greater degree of religious tolerance there. But what is interesting is that in a whole number of other places, the Portuguese actually begin to deploy a solution of a certain type, and we'll see that this is a type which is going to become more and more significant, more and more important. And this brings me at last to my first Indian example, right, which is Kochi. Now, here the Portuguese enter by a rather particular route, not conquest, right? They actually sign a treaty with the king in 1500, ratified in 1503. They build a small fortress, and then they begin to do something which is going to become typical of a number of such settlements, which is they are going to actually partition the settlement, right? So there will be one part of the settlement which will be for the European residents, and then the other part of the city for the other Indian and other Asiatic residents. In the case of Cochin, what tends to happen is that the second part of the city is where the Raja lives. The Raja has his palace there, and all the people who are protected by the Raja also live in that part. And I'll come in a minute to some of the people whom the Raja protected. And then you have this part over here, which is, so this is what the Portuguese call Cochin de Baixo, which is the lower Cochin, and then you have Cochin de Cima, which is the upper part, which is where the Raja lives. And here the Portuguese start with a little fort, but then eventually they will wind up more or less building walls around the whole of the settlement, especially in the early 17th century in the face of Dutch attacks and so on. And this, incidentally, will eventually also become the Dutch settlement after 1663 when the Dutch take over Cochin. So this is a segregated city now, which has emerged, right? So it's taken an element of the morphology where different people live in different areas and, shall we say, exaggerated it and pushed it a step further. Interesting to see who winds up on the two sides, right? So, of course, you would say the Portuguese wind up on this side, but all Portuguese? No, actually it's a little bit more complicated than that, because one of the things which happens as we move into the 1520s and the 1530s and so on is that Portuguese Jews, who by this time are starting to feel the pressure of the Portuguese Inquisition, which is starting to consolidate around the 1530s, will often disguise themselves as Christians and wind up coming to Asia. They will wind up coming to the Portuguese settlements. Some of them choose to live in Cochin for a very obvious reason, because there is an existing Jewish community over there. So there's an affinity between the two. These Portuguese Jews have often, to an extent, lost their Jewish culture. So in fact, this is also an occasion for them to recover it. And of course, we know what remains of some of it, which is in Matancheri, the Jewish synagogue, much reworked and rebuilt and so on and so forth. We can actually reconstitute quite a few things about the history of this community from a number of different sources. I will just mention one text to you, a very interesting text, actually written in Surat, not in Cochin, but it's called Notícias dos Judeus de Cochin, News of the Jews of Cochin, written in the 17th century, where the author, who goes by the name of Mosé Pereira de Paiva, that's not his real name, his real name is Pedro Pereira, but never mind. So he actually visited Cochin. He was had a typical profile. He was a diamond merchant. Right? And of course, this also accounts for his attraction to Gujarat. So he was a diamond merchant, traveled in the Indian Ocean, and recovered this history of the Jews of Cochin, where he lays out some of the elements that we know, that there were different kinds of Jews who had existed before the 16th century, the Sephardic Jews who arrive subsequently, and of course, he catches the very beginning of a new process, which was, of course, much discussed by Oshin Dasgupta in his first book, Malabar and Asian Trade, which is the arrival of the Baghdadi Jews into Cochin in the 17th century, and then who consolidate their position in the 18th century. Here's an example of a set of Jews who arrive with the Portuguese, right? So this is a family which in Portugal, in medieval Portugal, goes by the name of Ibn Yahya. And so you have different members of it. Jacob ibn Yahya is the transitional figure who lives through that difficult moment of the suppression of Judaism and the sort of semi-expulsion of the Jews in the late 15th century. And then later on, as you come down into the lower generations, they take a different surname. Some of them keep the name Ibn Yahya. These are people who go to the Ottoman Empire. And then there's a whole bunch of people who come to India. And the ones who come to India take two different names. Some of them call themselves Pinto, and some of them call themselves Castiel. And these Castiels are incredibly important figures in Cochin, because we know that they became the chief ministers of the Rajas of Cochin. Right? And the Rajas of Cochin treasured them because they were extremely well informed about Portuguese activities. They were extremely capable in terms of negotiating and so on and so forth. And eventually the Portuguese are going to become so disturbed by these people that in the case of the second Samuel Castiel that you see over there, they will actually organize a raid from their part of Cochin to the other part of Cochin, go to Samuel Castiel's house and kill him. Right? Because they can't really cope up with the fact that this man is providing constant advice to the Raja. So you actually have these people who might have come as settlers to Portuguese Cochin, but don't remain there. They actually traverse this frontier and go back and forth between the two sides of it. And in a similar vein, when the Dutch take over Cochin, you have a somewhat similar phenomenon, which is to say you do have Europeans who stay on the Dutch side, but you also will have Europeans who traverse and go over onto the other side, some of whom actually wind up working as mercenaries, some of them working in other capacities. So you can see now that I'm developing an idea of a second distinct type of city, which is the European city, which is a partitioned city, right? But this type of city, which has emerged now in the 16th century, does not become the dominant form of port city in the case of the Indian Ocean. And by the way, let me remind you that in the case of the ethnogenesis question, I mean, there is always the question of asking, for instance, these Portuguese Jews, or New Christians, as they're sometimes called, if they've ostensibly converted, which side of the ethnic divide do they actually stand on? Are they to be counted as Portuguese, or to be counted as not Portuguese? For certain purposes, they see themselves as the one and the other. So let me come to perhaps my preferred example of Indian Ocean port cities, right? And which shows you the survival of a different style of port city well into the 18th century. And this is the city of the auspicious city of the Bandar-e Mubarak of Surat in Gujarat. This is a map from the 18th century, drawn by a Swedish visitor to Surat, Christoph Brad. And you can see that by this time, Surat has taken on a certain shape, right? So if you actually look at this concentric circle, so you have the river. So the city is not right on the ocean, unlike, let's say, Cochin or Malacca. It's actually up the river. And so, in fact, those of you who know the area will know that if you go up the river, on the other bank, the left bank, you have Randed. And on this bank, you have Surat, right? Randed is a little bit further up. Now, what you actually have here is a city where you can see these two concentric circles of fortification, which some observers in the 18th century claimed had different names, these two walls. The outside wall was built later. The inside wall seems to have existed already in the 17th century. And then, if you actually look at it, there is a little fort at the middle, and I'm going to come back to that fort. Now, Surat was a city which existed certainly in the late 15th century, early 16th century. It was less important at that time than Randed. But in the course of the 16th century, it grew to become more and more important. And in fact, fortunately for us, we have a number of different sources for it, including the sources of the Portuguese, who had a big problem with Surat, because this was a city which they wanted to control but never managed to control. Right? So this is a Portuguese drawing of Surat from the early 17th century, a failed expedition against the English in Surat, which took place. So at the heart of the matter is what used to be called the Surat Castle. And this is quite unusual because there are relatively few artillery fortresses and port cities in Asia which are not built by the Europeans. And this is an artillery fortress which is technically not built by a European, though he's a sort of European. Right? So who built this castle? Who built this fort? It was built, by the way, it's being renovated these days in a slightly Disneyland style. So for those of you who want to pay it a visit. So this was a fort which was constructed in the 1540s. So before the Mughal conquest, the Mughals conquered the city in the 1570s. But before the Mughal conquest, there was already this fort. So who was this fort actually constructed by? And we know because the person who built this fort is buried right there in the Marjan Shami Rosa. He was actually an Ottoman, right? But he was a complicated Ottoman. He was an Ottoman who came from southern Italy, from Otranto. And he was one of those Christians who had probably been, as a child, picked up and taken into the Ottoman Empire, grew up as an Ottoman and as a Muslim. He was called Khaja Safar, but he had the title in Gujarat of Khudavand Khan. And he built this fortress, he said, to preserve Surat and to preserve its city from the depredations of the Firangis, from the Franks, because the Portuguese used to come, sail up from Goa, come up the river and bombard the city. So it was to preserve them from that. So what happened then was that eventually he wound up being killed in a combat against the Portuguese. He decided to be buried here, but what is actually interesting is that this is a double tomb because there is a second person buried here. And the second person who's buried here, whose name actually is on the tomb, is somebody called Sidi Marjan. Sidi Marjan was an East African, right? Was an Ethiopian who was present in the area of Daman, where the Ethiopians had a very important settlement between the 1530s and the 1550s. He too fought against the the Portuguese, and he's described in the Portuguese in the Arabic chronicles of Gujarat as a mujahid and also as a shaheed, because he was eventually killed by the Portuguese. But his people brought his body and put him in the same area. And interestingly, the Jesuits in the late 16th century visiting Surat said that of the two people who were buried, it was actually Sidi Marjan who was more important, because it was believed that he had all kinds of powers. He could protect sailors, he could give fertility to women, and so on and so forth. So in fact, there was a whole cult. Now, we can see Surat very clearly from a slightly later period, slightly before Brad's map. And this is, of course, the famous Surat cloth map from the city palace in Jaipur. Right? This is a wonderful map, not in the European style, not exactly proportionate in terms of its topography and so on, but it has this great virtue, which is that every site is marked. And every site is marked in 2 languages. So every site is marked in Persian and in some form of Hindi Rajasthani. So you have the 2 versions, and you can see that the center of it is the fort. You can see that there are sites around the fort, the mint. There is the residence of the city governor, the darbar of the city governor, and you can see you can get a sense of every place. Now, just to give you very rapidly then the chronology, 1540 Surat is fortified, 1570 is the Mughal conquest, 1630s there's the great famine in Western India, which is a big shock for Surat. There is then subsequently in 1660s a major attack by Shivaji and others, which has also an effect. So Surat is going to live through one crisis after another, but always somehow manage to survive. In 1690s, there's a whole bunch of European pirates who show up in the Western Indian Ocean and begin attacking its shipping. Again, in the 1730s, there is another crisis, which again, Das Gupta has discussed. And eventually, of course, in 1759, it'll fall under the control of the English with the so-called Castle Revolution, when a local notable of Central Asian origin, as it happens, Mian Achan, is going to be a go-between by which the English can take over the castle. So here, again, is the sense of it. You have this organization in quarters, with names, for instance, Sayyidpura, which you have over there, Salabatpura, Rustampura, which is named for a great Parsi entrepreneur called Rustamji Manakji, living in Surat in the 17th century, who actually helped to finance the ransom which had to be paid to Shivaji in the 1660s in part. Begumpura, which is named for Jahanara Begum, the daughter of Shah Jahan, who had shipping interests and some interests in this area. But actually, if you look at Surat, and this is thanks in particular to one of our Japanese colleagues, Hiromu Nagashima, who has gone through and very carefully listed every site that you can find, you can actually see that once again, this is not a city which is organized by ethnicity. It's not as if different people of different ethnicities live in different areas. There are, of course, an organization by great Havelis of significant personages. There is an organization by certain kinds of other aspects, sometimes by profession. So you can see that there is a place which is called Kagazipura, which is presumably where the paper makers lived. There is a place for the fish sellers and so on and so forth, but it's not organized, as I said, by necessarily by ethnicity. There is, of course, something which you can find here which subsequently disappeared, which is a very interesting thing, which is the huge site of a particular Sufi silsila coming from southern Arabia, not the most famous of the Sufi silsilas that we have in northern India, not the Chishtis, not the Naqshbandis, but the Aidarusis. And the Aidarusis seem to have had the hugest establishment in Surat at this time from the 17th into the 18th century. So this is a city then which I would describe as organized schematically somewhat like this. You have the Mughal state which is present, has its governor and so on. You have the East India companies which come in the early 17th century. You have the magnates, of whom there's a limited number at any given time. But then you have smaller people, brokers, merchants, peddlers, artisans. But the morphology of the town does not, as I said, follow ethnicity. We have a density of documents for Surat, enormous density, much greater than probably for any other port city, I would guess, for the 17th century, including some surprising things. Recently, Muzaffar Alam and I worked on this particular letter, which is a letter which is written by 3 Gujarati bania merchants from the 1650s to someone whom they thought was the King of England, but they were not aware at this time that Cromwell was ruling England. So they still call him the Padshah and so on. And they complained to the ruler of England about the fact that they are being badly treated, especially by the Dutch. And they asked him to help them out against the Dutch. So they sign on the back with their names in Gujarati, and then you can see they're called Chauth. One of them is called Chauth, one of them is called Tulsidas Parekh, and one of them is called Benidas. And they sign here, as I said, in Gujarati, but the text itself is written in Persian, presumably by a Persian scribe whom they had access to. So this is not uncommon then also to traverse these linguistic frontiers in terms of a Gujarati bania merchant writing to the English king is essentially adopting the same conventions and manners of writing that he would where he were addressing a Mughal governor or the Mughal emperor. Right? We have, as I said, a big density of such materials. We have the Dutch materials starting from the early 17th century, listing some of the great merchants. In 1615, we already have a significant list. To just give you a very quick sense of also the evolution of these merchants. Different merchants dominated different points in time. There's a great diversity of them. There are bania merchants. There are, for instance, Virji Vora, who is a Jain merchant, a very important figure through the middle decades of the 17th century, a great broker as well, not a ship-owning merchant, so far as we know, but who allegedly leaves a fortune when he dies of rupees 8 million in 1660 in current terms. Is an enormous amount of money. And so it's really a mixture of different kinds of factors. You have Haji Zahid Beg, who is the Shah Bandar in the 1620s and who trades very extensively across the Western Indian Ocean and so on. Of course, the locus classicus for all of this, need I remind you, are the various works of Ashin Das Gupta, his book on Surat, and then his collected essays which came out about 2 decades ago. But there's also some interesting other little things which I want to mention to you. Armenian historians have of late become more and more interested in Surat and have found many, many traces of an Armenian presence there. So the Armenians show up there. We don't know exactly when, but probably in the late 16th, early 17th century. We know there were Armenians who were significant in the Mughal court, roughly from around that time. This is an Armenian tomb from Surat. The Armenian cemetery is located right by the Dutch cemetery. And this is not a coincidence because the Dutch and the Armenians actually had very extensive dealings. And there were a significant number of intermarriages between the Dutch and the Armenians. The Dutch, arriving in the first couple of generations, did not have Dutch women with them. And so they would seek out women who were at least Christians. Perhaps not Protestant Christians, but at least Christians. And so very often the alliances which they would make, as you can see over here, would be with some of the significant Armenian go-betweens in Iran as well as in India who were willing to actually engage in these dealings. So, as I said, huge amount of density of materials. We also have the famous shipping lists, the Dutch shipping lists for Surat, where for certain years you can get a listing of all the ships coming and going in the port, which means actually that the Dutch had a spy in the customs house, right, who was giving them this information. And so they were listing not only, as you can see over here, not only the ship, but actually the rough cargo. How many mons of this, how many packs of that, and so on. So you can actually really retrace some of this in detail. So the Armenians remain important all the way into the 18th century. The Dutch listing of the great Armenian fortunes in 1750. You can still see there are some big Armenian fortunes over there. And they are just one of many such groups. The Armenians, let me remind you, function typically in a multilingual environment. They function in Armenian, but they always function in Persian. So in fact, that's one of the great advantages also of dealing with the Armenians, which is the Armenians can act as your go-between in dealing with, let's say, the Mughals or with the Safavids or whoever you wish to deal with. Surat, as I said, is a great city because it has this heavy density of accounts, heavy density of texts. I've written in some detail about this particular text, which is of a Frenchman who showed up in Surat in the 1640s. Now, the advantage with this Frenchman is that he didn't have a community, right? So since there was no group of Frenchmen to whom he could turn, he was obliged to constantly deal with other people. And it's interesting to see who he has affinities with and who he doesn't. It turns out his greatest affinities are with the English for some reason. Apparently there were French-speaking English merchants in the English factory at that point in time. And in a similar fashion, when we actually look at the details of a number of the other communities, we will see this again and again, which is the porosity of the dealings. So, for example, here is a map showing Surat at the point when it was attacked by Shivaji, right? And if you actually look at this site, you will see that by this time, 1660s, there is an Armenian church, there is an English factory, but there are also places, a sarai, in which the Turkish merchants and the Armenian merchants live together, right? So you can see that, again, the separation by ethnicity is far from being complete. We can again track some of these Armenian merchants in great detail. I won't go into extensive detail with regard to some of this. A great figure, Khoja Minas. We can actually track him from the time he was traveling with Boulay Leguz, whom I just showed you in the 1640s, his death in the 1680s, and so on and so forth. So I have a lot more detail. My time is beginning to run out, so I just want to give you now a sense of how the fortunes of a city such as this, its morphology, its composition, and so on shift. First of all, of course, the city's outreach changes with time, right? So its connections are of one sort in the 16th century, of another sort in the 17th century. Just to give you one example, from the 1640s, Surat begins direct trade with Manila. And so once you get this direct trade with Manila, you get dealings with, of course, the Spanish government on the one hand, but you also presumably then have people going and coming back and forth. By the way, the Surat dealing with Manila, the Armenians are very useful for this, because in Manila, in the customs house, you get a reduction if you're a Christian, right? So you pay lower tariffs if you're a Christian than if you were, let's say, a Muslim or a Hindu. So we have materials like that. We see again the connections. Eventually, some kind of peace is made with the Portuguese. Right? The Portuguese began by attacking this place, but by the time you get to the 17th century, the Portuguese have become a secondary power. They're negotiating. The Portuguese have a representative there who buys and sells horses. The Portuguese are there buying and selling diamonds. We saw that with the Portuguese Jewish merchant who was there. You have even people like the sons of Khoja Nuh, the son of Khoja Minas over here, dealing with the Portuguese. And so this big diversity that you see of the trading of a place like Surat by the 1680s, is trading with a whole bunch of different places, very large number of ships. By the 1690s, there are roughly 111 ships coming and going from this port, gives you a sense of this diversity. And this takes me eventually to my last example. So we've seen that you had the Malacca style of city, you had the Hormuz style of city, already somewhat different from one another. Then you saw the Cochin partitioned city, which the Portuguese begin to try to introduce in the 16th century, but which does not become the dominant form. Surat, I would say, still remains the typical or more dominant form of port city, not separated by ethnicity, not partitioned, and so on. Say if you were to go to Machilipatnam on the Coromandel coast, you would find something much closer to Surat, perhaps. But eventually, that is not going to be the type of city which will be the dominant city as comes to emerge in the latter half of the 17th century and the 18th century. And to give you an example of the latter style of city, and not only because Sudha Gopalakrishnan is here, let me say a few things about Chennai or Madras. Right? So you can see here, again, it has a certain resemblance to Surat in the sense that the core of the matter is a fort, right? Created by treaty with the local ruler, Damarla Venkatappa Nayak, in the around 1640. the settlement then gets built around the fort. So this looks like it might be Surat, but no, it isn't. It is a very different kind of city, because what eventually happens, and this is a problem because this is it's oriented north-south this way. I mean, this is the normal way in which you would see Madras, right? Oriented north-south that way. You can still see the fort in the middle. The Fort St. George still exists. But this is, again, a city which is the segregated, partitioned city, right? It is the partitioned city where the area around the fort will eventually become the White Town. And then as you move out from there, as you move out into Tiruvallikaini, to Triplicane and so on, you are into what is called the native city, the Black Town, and so on. And as we push further and further out, this is essentially what happens as the city eventually expands. There is one complication, of course, in the case of Madras, which is that there was a pre-existing settlement. And that pre-existing settlement is to the south that you see over there, just to the north of the Adayar River. Right? And that is this settlement, right? And this is the settlement of São Tomé, which the Portuguese had settled in the 1510s. So they were there before the English. And eventually what is going to happen is that this Portuguese city will be incorporated into the English city. So what you will get is then the White Town, the Black Town, and then this, dare I call it, Mestizo Town, because the Portuguese have been there already for 5 generations. It's more Catholic in its orientation. And of course, this is, of course, eventually in the 19th and 20th century will become the very bastion of Brahmanism, which is Mylapore. So this is then a complicated city incorporating different elements, but fundamentally working with that partitioned city as a concept. Partitioned city, which the French in Pondicherry will, furthest to the south, will also work with in the 1680s, 1690s. And we can see this eventually when we get to read some of the non-European accounts of Madras as it emerges, where it's the indigenous populations, sometimes some other people talking about living in Madras in texts in Telugu or sometimes in Sanskrit even, right? And I just give you one little last example. This is a kind of an imaginary text where 2 Gandharvas are flying over South India and doing a kind of bird's eye view of different places. They start passing over Udupi and places like that. And eventually they come to Chennapatnam, to Madras. So there are these 2 Gandharvas, one of whom is a pessimist and one of whom is an optimist. So the pessimist says, here's a populated city filled with evil people, mostly Hunas, devoid of all virtue. There is no one worse than Hunas in this world. They are merciless. They treat Brahmins with contempt as if they were no better than blades of grass. Language cannot express their vices. They care nothing for rules of purity. So this is your downside of the European presence. And then the other one replies, look, even these people have their own excellent qualities. They never take others' money unjustly by force. They speak no falsehood. They create marvelous things. So the aspect of the marvelous and the wonderful. They punish offenders in their own manner according to rule. Observe these virtues even here among the Hunas with their many flaws. Of course, this is a kind of an ambivalence with regard to the Europeans, which persists well into the 19th century, and dare I say, well into our days. Thank you very much.
Really mesmerizing.
Thank you, sir, for that extraordinary bird's eye view that brought to life the port cities of the past and its people. May I invite Professor Gitanjali Surendran to propose the vote of thanks.
Would you be able to take a few questions? Okay. Although we haven't included in the program, but I think it would be fair to give a little chance to members of the audience to maybe pose a few questions. So we will do this for 5 minutes. We can't do more than that. Any question that you would like to ask? Please identify yourself and please make your question very short. We'll take 2-3 questions. Yes, please. If you can stand up, please, and speak into the mic.
Yeah, you do now.
I would have thought that an account of this maritime area would have started with the periplus of the Erythraean Sea of like 78 AD or whatever it was. And secondly, who were the Hunas in that last section? Because I associated Hunas with people from the Caucasian areas.
Okay. Any other question? Yes, please.
Shail Mayaram. Thank you, Sanjay, for that galactic presentation and your thoughts. I had two quick questions. One is, what about the ports of the rivers, on the rivers? I mean, thinking globally, Frankfurt on Main, the Mississippi, the Yangtze River. You know, there's a kind of liminal port as well. Secondly, on the segregated city, you know, you factored in ethnicity. Of course, you raised a question about that in the beginning, but there's also, I think, religion, and especially if one looks at the Islamic city, you know, the division into, you know, various kinds of quarters, you know, the Jewish quarter and you know, various other kinds of quarters. So it's more complicated. And I think in the South Asian case, the very nice you know, image you had of Surat. So caste is also coming in, and artisanal, you know, there's an interface with that. So before and thirdly, I just want to say you didn't say anything about cosmopolitanism. Yeah.
Okay. One more question. Inviting. Anyone from this side? No? Yeah, please.
Hi, good morning, sir. Sir, my name is Shauban Ahmed, and though my question is not directly on the topic, but in one of your interviews, I saw that you were talking about global historians. So what do you mean by that? And my second question would be...
One question, please.
Yeah?
Please, one question. We don't have time.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah.
Okay.
Professor Subrahmanyam?
Yeah. Sorry, I think we have to have that conversation separately. It's not what I'm talking about today. Okay? The global historians, happy to talk to you separately. With regard to the other questions, very rapidly, you'll notice that my focus essentially here is on the later medieval and the early modern. That being the case, I think that indeed one could go back to the periplus, and we could go back to much earlier periods, and I think that perhaps Will Dalrymple will take us there presently. Right, so that's the reason why I did not deal with it. I'm focusing here on a period which is starting in the 15th century. The Hunas are the Europeans here. Of course, the Hunas as a term is used sometimes derogatorily, even for the Muslims in some of the Sanskrit texts of the period. Right, there are different terms which are used, but so the term Huna, with its of course origins being what they are, in Central Asia, eventually becomes transferred and becomes just as the term, for example, Yavana, which is Ionian, therefore Greek originally, is something which moves and gets transferred. Again, it's an interesting example of ethnogenesis, if you like. Right, river ports. Yes, actually, it's an interesting separate study that I'm in the process of actually completing with Muzaffar Alam, where I think we are trying to rethink something which relatively few people have worked on, which is the Ganges as an axis for the Mughals. It's not something which is very well known, but apparently there was an idea, somewhat discussed, to transfer the Mughal capital to Allahabad. With the logic being that it was a much more central place and it was much better located to control the Gangetic Valley and so on and so forth. But eventually it came to nothing. But it was something which was up in the air. But if you follow the Ganges, indeed, you can see that. You can see that with Banaras further down, Patna, and then, of course, technically, after all, even Calcutta and Hooghly are river ports, not oceanic ports. Yes, to be sure, a complete view should also do that, but I think I had enough on my plate already. The Islamic city is something which I'm a little skeptical of as a concept. I don't think there is such a thing as an Islamic city. There are Islamic cities. There are many kinds of different cities that exist in the Islamic world, but I think one would be, hard put to move from Rabat in Morocco to a random city in the Mughal Empire to Yogyakarta and say, that they have morphological features necessarily in common. Yeah. But it's certainly true, and I do hope that I did bring out the fact that religion is very much of a factor, and in fact, it's a constant presence in many of these things that I've talked about at various levels, whether I'm talking about the Jews in Cochin or et cetera. Cosmopolitanism was something which I was sort of leaving in a way for people to tease out from what was out there. And I think I've actually taken my position on this already in writing. I believe that cosmopolitanism is not a concept which should be limited to the European sphere, as some historians like to do, claiming that in a way only Europeans are capable of cosmopolitanism. I think that if one actually takes a sufficiently large definition of cosmopolitanism as it is presented even by writers in the 17th century, you can see that many of these cities actually do fit the thing. And I'll just leave you with a single little anecdote. There is a very interesting little short story by a French writer called Bernardin de Saint-Pierre in the 18th century. It's called The Café of Surat, and in which he talks about how there was a cafe in Surat, and comes back to your other point, in which people from different religions came, and they all debated, and each one put forward his religious point of view, and they all got into fisticuffs, and there was a tremendous fight, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, at the very end, the wise man in the place said, well, all of these religions are equally true or equally false. They are merely different ways of taking you towards the same truth. And so the person who emerges as triumphant is what in Enlightenment terms would be called a deist, right? Someone who abstracts the essence from various different religious traditions. But what I found very interesting is that Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, who traveled a lot, when he wanted to choose a fictional location for this dialogue, what did he choose? Surat.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Subrahmanyam.
Good morning. Let me begin by this vote of thanks by sincerely offering my gratitude on behalf of the organizers and everyone present here to Professor Sanjay Subrahmanyam for making this very long trek to Delhi and for delivering a characteristically erudite keynote address. So thank you so much. I've been reading Professor Subrahmanyam's work, as I'm sure many of you have in this room, since I was a young student, 20 years ago. And as I sat down to draft this note, I just thought back to an article that was particularly influential that you wrote in 1997 on connected history, and I see this in your latest book as well. And in it, among the many things that you say, you talk about how it's not just bullion and firearms and mercenaries that are doing the rounds and crossing political boundaries, but also ideas and mental constructs. And I feel like that is and therefore, we should focus on connected history rather than, separable or comparable histories or comparative history. I think that's particularly important because it opens up a world of possibilities we hope to explore in this conference. Thank you, too, for sharing your latest work. If I'm not mistaken, it's from your book, Across the Green Sea, at least some of it. And many of the things you've said about shifting boundaries, detailed typologies of port cities, which could apply to other things besides, instability of categories like ethnicity and so on, I think all set a very good tone for us for the next 2 days. So thank you so much. I want to take this opportunity to extend a special thanks to Ambassador Shyam Saran, President of the IIC, who through his leadership and vision have given us this space, a space to discuss and debate issues, not just of academic importance, but of importance to the public discourse in general. In every way, I think IIC remains a very important space in this city in our times. Thank you, too, to the director of the IIC, Mr. K. N. Shrivastava, who through his good cheer and unrelenting support and his attention to details made this conference possible. I express my gratitude to the International Research Division led by Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan and colleagues Niharika Gupta, Arpan Guha, Amita, and many others. To them goes the credit of converting ideas to action, for they have extended the invitations, coordinated between advisors and invitees, and handled the logistics. A committee of advisors, the organizing committee for this conference, met several times to discuss various aspects of the next 2 days. Thank you for your time and your advice and support. The programs office, led by Tete, is an institution in itself, so thank you for your efforts. A really successful 2-day conference actually serves to hide all the tremendous efforts of the various IIC divisions over months prior, so thank you for all your effort. Over the next 2 days, a number of scholars will be presenting their research work, their labors of love, to an open audience. I thank them for the gift of their research and for sharing it with us in advance. And finally, a very big thank you to the audience for your presence and for your engagement. May this conference spark many ideas, tell many stories, and send us in directions we had not previously considered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gitanjali. Now I invite Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan to honor the speaker. Yes, just a moment. Yes.
Why is it that there are no Indian hotels in navigation?
There are. Huh? Yes, yes, yes. I mean, not a huge
Sanjay, you are supposed to get up for this.